Hi, I'm Ashley McElwain, licensed marriage and family therapist and founder and CEO of Foundation Restoration. Welcome to Foundation Restoration's Real Talk podcast, where you'll find real people discussing real issues while offering real help at the intersection of clinical expertise and a biblical perspective. We're so glad you've joined us. Welcome back, friends. So excited to have you join us for part 3 of our intimacy series on diving into deeper connection. Have realized that this is a much bigger conversation than I had originally anticipated. And so we spilled into 3 parts. Super excited, though, to discuss this, just this concept of being created for connection. And realizing that from the time God created Adam, that we see God knew we needed connection. We needed that relationship with Him and with others. And that marriage offers a very unique opportunity for connection, unlike any other relationship. And oftentimes we miss out on that connection of being fully known and fully loved, which is truly a gift like none other. And so we've spent two podcasts already talking about how to understand the various types of intimacy and how to cultivate that connection and oneness in our marriage. In part 1, we really talked a lot about how God created relationship, that we see this in the creation story in Genesis. We see how we're made in the image of God, who as a triune God, God the Father, Jesus Christ the Son, and the Holy Spirit, that 3-in-1 Trinity that we are made in the image of, and that mysterious and powerful oneness in the Trinity is a desire that God has for us in our marriage of to become one, and that He desires relationship with us. And then we kind of broke down just what is intimacy, that deep, meaningful, vulnerable nakedness that bonds us with someone in a profoundly unifying way. It's an attachment and depth of being known that's indescribable. It's a being completely bare and raw with our feelings, our thoughts, and inner workings that facilitates also a freedom in our physical nakedness in our marriage. And then we spent some time talking about the 3 types of intimacy: spiritual intimacy, emotional intimacy, and physical intimacy. And that was all in kind of part 1. And so I'd encourage you, if you didn't take a listen, go back, listen to part 1. It's kind of just gives you the whole context then of part 2 and then today's part 3. In part 2, we specifically talked about spiritual intimacy, how to cultivate it, and then some of the obstacles that can hinder our spiritual intimacy in our marriage. And that spiritual intimacy is creating a shared relationship with the Lord, kind of creating that couple's faith. And it's cultivating a why in our marriage that propels us then into our what, the emotional intimacy. So the emotional intimacy in part 2, we talked about that day-to-day dependence and enjoyment of one another. And then we started breaking down ways to cultivate that emotional intimacy. And that conversation was taking a little bit longer. We decided to break that into 2 sections. And so partway through, we had talked about meaningful conversation, various facets of that, and then vulnerability and openness. And so today, for part 3, we're picking up with that, cultivating emotional intimacy and some ways to do that. Something I mentioned is these are not comprehensive lists. My desire for you is to hear this and to find that you have your own ideas sparked, your creativity sparked, and that you and your spouse can sit down and talk about how you may be able to specifically do this in your marriage. And we'll also break down some obstacles to your emotional intimacy. And again, I'd love for that dialogue to extend beyond hearing the podcast. And so if you can convince your spouse to listen to it, maybe you guys can listen and come together and have some meaningful conversation about these things and come up with your own little action items and game plan into it. So we're going to pick back up with ways to cultivate your emotional intimacy. So I'm so excited that you're here. I hope that you find a lot of value in this 3-part series. So let's go. A third way to develop emotional intimacy would be healthy conflict resolution. Again, if you've been married more than a minute, you know conflict's going to arise between you and your spouse. And we need to have the ability to navigate those obstacles and differences together because every couple fights. Gottman, Doctors John and Julie Gottman, they're leading researchers in our field of study. They have these couple labs, and really they're kind of their go-to resource for those of us in this mental health field, specifically working with couples. And they say 80% of conflict is basically unsolvable. They're repeated issues that are always going to plague our relationship because we just fundamentally don't see the eye to eye on them. And so it's really how we fight, how we repair, how we dialogue about it. Do you value those moments of conflict as a means of establishing a deeper connection and understanding of our spouse? And so realizing that we're going to fight, but I'm still in your corner and you're still in my corner. And so let's fight about it. Let's talk about it. Let's see how we can navigate this together and see if we can come up with any new solutions. Let me hear you out, and I want to be heard out, and let's seek understanding. I think about Proverbs 27:17 that says iron sharpens iron. And I tell couples, do not run from healthy conflict resolution. Fighting in a marriage is totally normal, and it's necessary, and it's healthy. When I think about it like iron sharpens iron, that's a painful process. If you've ever seen a knife sharpened, there are little pieces, shavings of metal being rubbed off. And that's not a fun process. And so as human beings, as a husband and wife who's trying to seek the Lord, we're going to be rubbing each other the wrong way. But hopefully in that it's a refining. And in that refining, we are made into a more effective tool for the Lord to use. That is, I believe, one of God's leading desires in our marriage is that we refine one another, we grow one another, we sharpen one another so that we can be more effectively used by Him. So embrace the healthy conflict resolution. Embrace those arguments and realize, hey, this is a moment for us to establish a deeper understanding and connection with each other. Let's fight through this side by side. Fourth means of cultivating emotional intimacy, build a life together. That might sound silly, like of course we are. We bought a house together, we have kids together, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not saying go through the motions or just take the next logical step. I'm saying be intentional about asking one another, how are we creating shared dreams, passions, and goals? What are our goals as individuals and as a couple? Are you interwoven into one another's lives in a way that furthers individual goals and passions as well as establishing a shared purpose? This can be financial goals. Where do we want to be in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? This can be shared dreams. Hey, you know what? We love to work really hard for the next 10 years, establishing some financial stuff so that we can then, pull back on our jobs and start doing mission work more often. Or maybe it's just, again, it can be a number of things, but it's what are you passionate about as individuals and then as a couple? And are you having those conversations? Are you pushing through to help one another build a genuine life together side by side with a deep understanding of what the other person wants and needs in life and what God's called them to, how God's equipped them, and vice versa? Fifth, shared experiences. This is simply enjoying one another's company. This can be challenging sometimes if our spouse has very different interests, but I always say, that's okay. You're interested in your spouse, so you can be interested in what they're interested in. I know there's one particular couple I remember, a friend of mine, the husband was super into cars. The wife just didn't get it, didn't care, had no interest in it. And the wife's like, why do I have to care about cars when, you know what I'd love? I'd love to do puzzles. I love puzzles. And husband's, I hate doing puzzles. I have no interest in doing puzzles. And I said, well, why don't you guys do a car puzzle? and then talk about why you're so into cars, why you're so into puzzles. What do you like about puzzles? Have you always done puzzles? Was that part of your family growing up? Why? Same thing with the cars. What's your favorite car? Why is that your favorite car? We must be interested in our spouse enough to be interested in what they're interested in. That's a lot of interesteds. Hopefully you tracked with me there, but it's enjoying one another's company. It's creating memories. It's engaging in the interest of one another, laughing and playing together, creating a newness and a friendship and an excitement in the relationship. It's just that, hey, I want to try something new with you. I want to share this with you. I want to experience this with you. And that's just a really unique, awesome opportunity. The sixth thing I'd say is just pursuit. Are you pursuing the heart of one another? Are you being intentional about pursuing a connection and a deeper level with your spouse? And again, this can kind of be through those subsequent things or the preceding things that I mentioned. But again, it's just that intentional, I'm pursuing you. And the goal is for that to be a reciprocal process. It's hard when one person is the pursuer and the other person's the receiver. Really, we both need to be pursuing one another and pursuing that connection. Some obstacles to emotional intimacy. Again, I feel like this could be a very, very long list. So I'm just going to hit on a few things. Just an unwillingness or lack of desire by one or even both spouses to cultivate this. Sometimes it's, hey, I'm content just to, take care of the house, take care of the kids, and you do your thing, I do my thing, and that's that. And it's more of a roommate situation or a business arrangement. And so that can make it really challenging when you find yourself in that position, when you're longing for more and the other person isn't. And I do think that that's when professional intervention is probably helpful. That's where if you have a church community, that can be really helpful to kind of help maybe the other spouse realize the importance of it. And certainly I think that it's incredibly challenging when you find yourself in that situation. Unresolved conflict can hinder the emotional intimacy. Again, if you're injured and hurt in your marriage for one reason or another, and that's unresolved, a spouse can't take responsibility for that or acknowledge that or make efforts to repair that. That obviously is going to hinder your ability to feel that there's safety and security to establish a deeper connection, right? Like if you didn't care for me in a moment that I needed you, it's going to make it very difficult to feel that you have that emotional safety to be completely naked with that person. A third obstacle, undervaluing in general just the need for emotional intimacy. And again, this is not picking on the men, but I see this a lot with men of, well, I don't need emotional intimacy. I just need her to do her part and I'm going to do my part. But that's just not true. Every human being longs for intimacy and connection and to be fully known and fully loved. And that requires from everybody in the marriage vulnerability and openness, or it cannot be forged. And what's interesting is a lot of times when I work with couples, the men find the greatest reward. They express, wow, I really didn't realize how much I needed to be vulnerable and known and loved. That goes against everything that I was taught or saw. To which I say, you are not alone. And just that emotional intimacy is so necessary for us in marriage. And it's such a blessing to be enjoyed. Another obstacle, outside negative influences. This can be unhealthy friendships who undermine the spouse, or in-laws. In-laws. That is one of the leading issues I see in marriage. That's a podcast for another day. But again, it can be somebody on the outside really creating division in a marriage and in the ability to fully attach and find security and intimacy with one another. Another obstacle is just the lack of skill set to know how to be emotionally intimate and vulnerable, which, again, I think that goes back to sometimes needing that professional development to build that skill set, having a community of people around that who can model this. And then the same obstacle as before, busyness, right? Like we're just busy. And so a lot of times we can lead parallel lives and not really seek out those connection opportunities. And we've just got to be intentional about carving out that time to connect meaningfully with our spouse. Okay. Listen to me. The third type of intimacy, that physical intimacy, this is the culmination of our oneness. So we have that spiritual intimacy. We know our why. That is propelling us then into our emotional intimacy to pursue our spouse, to cultivate emotional nakedness, vulnerability in every way, to be fully known and fully loved emotionally, then culminates in this physical oneness. There's two types of physical intimacy. One is non-sexual. And so that's I'm not necessarily looking for this to end in sex. This is just, I am enjoying the gift of physical touch. And so, I would encourage you in cultivating that to touch regularly, touch often. And that can be a long medicinal hug. That can be passionate kisses. That can be just a peck. That can be regular kisses. That can be kisses on the forehead, on the cheek, on the hand, a tenderness in your kisses. It can be massages. Again, a foot rub with lotion at the end of a long day, rubbing your hair, rubbing your spouse's back. Find out what they like, what relaxes them. Is there something, I carry a lot of tension in my neck and shoulders. So it's like I'll take a neck and back or shoulder massage anytime. Holding hands. Just walking hand in hand, or in the car holding hands, or again, it can be you're sitting there watching TV, but you're snuggled up, you're cuddled up, you're connected physically. And I would also add in this category eye contact, really looking at one another when you're talking or when you're listening. You're just staring into that other person's eyes and enjoying the connection that can come from that eye contact. And so just doing these things, incorporating them often. And then with our sexual physical intimacy, I could do a whole podcast on this as well. But really, I would say the number one thing about cultivating this is communication about it. Especially in the Christian community, we grow up where there is not a lot of communication about sex. We are told don't have sex until you're married. And that is what I see a lot in my work. There's not a lot of dialogue, not a lot of healthy, pure dialogue about sexual desire and sex and how it works or preferences or all of those things. And so I would say the first thing is for a husband and wife to get comfortable talking about sex with each other. And part of that can be preferences. Hey, do you have a time of day that you prefer? Are you a morning sex person, afternoon, evening, anytime, every time? Frequency. How often would you ideally love to have sex? Preferred positions. What are positions that you've historically found more pleasurable than others, that you've enjoyed? This can be do's and don'ts. I do not like when you do X, Y, or Z. I do love when you do A, B, or C. This can be, I like lingerie. I don't like lingerie. I like foreplay. I don't like foreplay. What do you define as foreplay? What types of foreplay do you like? How do you like to be initiated with, or who initiates? Again, it's funny. I've worked with couples who I'll say, she never initiates. And she's like, what? I always initiate. What? When? And then come to find out that, when she rubs his back a certain way, that was her way of initiating. He had no idea because they'd never talked about it. So again, it's really having the conversation of, what do these things look like to you? What do you prefer? And starting to have open, unhindered communication about sex with your spouse. Another way that you can cultivate your sexual intimacy is to build suspense. Flirt with each other. Maybe you send a sexy, flirty text to your spouse. Can't wait for you to get home. Can't wait for the kids to get to bed. Whatever that might look like. And that probably varies depending on your comfort level, but it's okay to build suspense. Some professionals talk about really establishing a schedule For some people that works, for some people it doesn't. I would say in some ways though, the thing that can be good about scheduling sex is you can kind of build the anticipation. Oh, Friday night, it's going down. And so you can kind of build that tension, this healthy sexual tension. And then the third thing I'd say about building sexual intimacy or cultivating it would be variety. Again, we have our familiar things and that's great, but maybe try a new position or try a new conversation about positions or things that you like or don't like. Try a new place that you've never done it in or haven't in a while, and that can be literally just a different room in the house. It can be getting a hotel room, going on a trip. Again, use your imagination. And maybe variety in initiation, how you initiate, what that looks like, and who initiates, and just kind of not getting too much into this is how we do it every single time. This is when we do it, but kind of creating a little bit of that variety and spontaneity. Obviously, some obstacles, again, there's a lot more than this, but some obstacles, having different drives, right? Like a husband and wife, a lot of times they don't have the same sexual drive, and that can be a challenge, right? But a lot of that goes back to the communication and being able to talk about, this is my ideal frequency. Well, this is my ideal frequency. Okay, how do we bridge the gap between that? And being creative about that and respectful of that. Lack of chemistry can be another huge obstacle. For some couples, you don't have the chemistry. And so that makes it much more difficult to desire to come together sexually or pursue one another sexually. And you can, I think in that point, you're working toward the ability to just create more of a rhythm and consistency to cultivate that desire. Guilt and shame. And again, I kind of touched on this, and especially in the Christian community, I see a lot of times there's just that it's a bad thing. They've been told their whole life sex is bad, sex is bad, sex is bad. They get married, sex is good. And the reality is that's just not how it works. Our brains don't work that way. Once we've kind of created and established in our brains that negative association, it can be very, very, very difficult for people to flip the switch and say, oh, this is a good thing that I can be unhindered in and fully enjoy. And again, that's something that really can take a lot of work to sort through and try to shift that mental paradigm that has been established. And the fourth obstacle I'd say, which kind of plays into that also, is just a discomfort and lack of knowledge. And again, especially if we're not having the emotional intimacy, we don't have the spiritual intimacy, but, especially when we don't have emotional intimacy, if we can't be emotionally naked, it's going to create a discomfort in our physical nakedness. And sometimes just that lack of knowledge of what are we doing. And again, that can really play into some of the purity culture. And just, your kids aren't being talked to about this. They don't know what they're doing. So then there's a lot of fear and anxiety around something that's meant to be very enjoyable and pleasurable. And, God created it. But that discomfort and lack of knowledge about how to successfully have sex or how your body works, how your spouse's body works, those are all things that can really create a lot of challenges in cultivating that sexual intimacy. Again, these are not comprehensive lists, but the reality is these are 3 areas of a marriage that we have to be very intentional about cultivating to establish a oneness, to really feel that our marriage is set apart from any other relationship. God desires for us to be in an intimate, fulfilling relationship with our spouse where we feel fully loved and fully known, where we feel cherished and understood, where there's excitement, yet familiarity and comfort, where we can be completely naked, spiritually, emotionally, and physically. It takes effort, though, and it takes the desire to pursue these areas of intimacy with our spouse day in and day out with the Lord's help. And so that is going to be our challenge. And I would encourage you to take what we've talked about today and to explore your own thoughts about this, your own lists, and talk about that with your spouse. What do they think intimacy is? What are ways they see that you are doing well in cultivating spiritual, emotional, or physical intimacy? What are areas maybe you need to improve in? And then coming up with your own list of what that looks like. There could be a lot of rich dialogue that comes out of that. And that's my desire always with these, is for you to be inspired and then propelled to, in your own life, ponder these things and build on them. So this is kind of the starter. And my hope is that you can carry on that conversation internally and with your spouse, and again, hopefully with your body of believers that you're connected with, that you can spark one another's ideas and creativity and encourage one another to develop that oneness and the intimacy in their marriage. Well, friends, this concludes this episode of the Real Talk podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. We're so glad you did. Remember, you were handcrafted by God, are dearly loved, and greatly needed in this world. We look forward to seeing you back here next time. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Real Talk. To stay connected, follow Foundation Restoration on Instagram and Facebook at FND Restoration, or visit us at www.foundationrestoration.org for more information. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please make sure to follow or subscribe and to leave us a 5-star review so more people can find our show. Foundation Restoration is a 501c3 nonprofit ministry that believes marriage is the heartbeat of society and exists to equip, strengthen, and restore marriages through clinical expertise and a biblical perspective. Please consider supporting our ministry with a tax-deductible donation at www.foundationrestoration.org. Your gift makes programs like this possible. Thank you for your generosity and partnership.